Hi, Assalamualaikum. We back to our beloved lecturer, Puan Nurul binti Harun. For today, we will be presenting to you about inflation in India. But first, let me introduce you to my group members. The first one will be AISYAH HUMAIRA binti SASTRA AMIJAYA, followed by me, Nurul FATIHAH, Nurul HADIRAH binti SHAH, Nurul Huda binti RAHIM, and SITI BALQIS binti Muhammad ZAKI. Here is the table of content for the presentation. First, introduction. Second, issues. Third, we will look at the analysis. And the last one will be the recommendation and conclusion. Inflation can be defined as a persistent and sustained increase in the aggregate or average price level for goods and services in the economy. To measure inflation, Consumer Price Index (CPI) is used by calculating data over a period of months or a year. According to Rangarajan in 1998, to maintain a reasonable degree of price stability while ensuring an adequate expansion of credit to assist economic growth have been the main goal of monetary policy in India. However, inflation rate in India is seen to be increased by 1.11% from 2018 to 2019. Therefore, throughout the presentation, we will be covering the issues, analysis, and also recommendation for inflation in India.
The main issue of inflation in India is global trade. Inflation in India generally occurs as a consequence of global traded commodities and the several efforts made by the Reserve Bank of India to weaken rupee against the dollar. This has been regarded as the root cause of inflation crisis rather than the domestic inflation. Further, on account of cheap products being imported in the country which are made on a high technological and capital-intensive techniques, happen to either increase the price of domestic raw materials in the global market, or they are forced to sell at a cheaper price, hence fetching heavy losses. The next issue of inflation in India is food inflation. Economists attribute low food prices to a string of factors, including bumper crop, low demand, low global prices, and muted impact of increased minimum support prices. Food inflation has been falling consistently in India since 2013 until 2014. Meanwhile, the prices in 2018 had risen by more than 10% annually. Some economists say the country may have graduated permanently to a low food inflation economy. Another issue of inflation in India is domestic factors. Generally, India have a lesser developed financial market in developing economies. It creates a weak bonding between the interest rates and the aggregate demand. This will cause the real money gap that could be determined as the potential determinant for the price rise and inflation in India. Other issue of inflation in India is external factors. An important component for the inflationary pressures that arises in India is the determination of the exchange rate. The liberal economic perspective in India affects the domestic markets. There are three main causes of inflation: demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and monetary inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when the aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate supply. It could be described as a situation where too much spending chasing too few goods. The prices of the commodity will rise as a result of scarcity in supply. Cost push inflation occurs when an increase in the cost of production decreases the aggregate supply and resulting in a price increase. Aggregate demand still remains the same, but the supplier can charge more for each unit since there are fewer goods or services. There are several factors causes the cost push inflation, such as fall in exchange rate, government regulation or taxation, import prices, and increases in supplier profit. Monetary inflation is a sustained increase in the money supply of a country which is resulting in price inflation. Money supply increases through an expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy. The expansionary monetary policy is executed by the monetary authorities and central bank. Meanwhile, the expansionary fiscal policy is executed by the federal government. Inflation could affect economy in positive ways or negative ways. The degree of the effects depends on whether inflation is anticipated or unanticipated. Anticipated inflation is inflation that people are more or less prepared for, and everyone will incorporate this expected higher level of inflation into the plans. The positive effects from anticipated inflation are results in higher profits, increased production, and stimulates market growth. However, the negative effects are reduce the real value of the tax burden, reduce standard of living, and people will try to avoid holding on to money. Meanwhile, the unanticipated inflation is inflation that comes as a surprise to the public or comes before the people have had time to adjust fully to its presence. The effects of unanticipated inflation are redistribution of income or wealth, discourages investments and savings, affects the balance of payments, and breakdown in the functions of money.
We move on to the next slide, which is about analysis. The statistic above in graph 1 shows the inflation rates of India from years 1984 until 2021. The inflation rate is the rate at which the general rise in the level of price, goods, and services in an economy occurs and affect the cost of living in a particular country. For example, 4% increase in the rate of inflation means an individual would need to spend 4% more on the good he was purchasing compared to year 2010. In 2021, it is forecast that the inflation rate will be at 3.62%, which increased 0.28% than year 2020. Next, Graph 2 shows about the inflation in emerging economies. The Consumer Price Index, which is CPI inflation rate in India, reached 12% in 2010, which is much higher than the group of other emerging economies, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Based on the graph, the inflation rate in India in 2010 was triple time than in China and South Africa, and roughly twice the level in Brazil and Russia. The trend in the inflation rate in India is striking and had a steady upward trend, while the other countries shows a sign to decline during the last decade. In India, they have a large population that is poor. Thus, food price inflation can be particularly important. In graph 3, the headline measure of wholesale price index, which is WPI, inflation in India has generally remained above 5% since 2009. In graph 4, food items which represent for around a quarter of the WPI are quite unstable. This is because production of food in India is heavily influenced by the monsoon season and supply chain inefficiency. At the end of 2013, the WPI inflation has been more moderated due to a good harvest and the effect of relatively tight monetary policy. Meanwhile, the WPI inflation of non-food components are more stable. The fuel and power component, which represent of 15% of the WPI, has been relatively stable since 2010. Although they receive a smaller weight in the index than food price, they also contribute to inflation. Unlike WPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is CPI, is calculated using a Las-Perez formula. The CPI contributes a much larger weight on food items than the WPI. The CPI in India have been increased rapidly over the previous year. It has been growing much faster than the WPI. The larger weight on food item in the CPI contribute for a large part of the difference between the rate of CPI and WPI inflation. Food item represent the most unstable component in consumer price, while inflation for the other major component remains stable. In graph 6, it shows that the price of services have been growing rapidly in recent due to services have a smaller weight than food. Next, graph 7 shows about core inflation. Although core inflation can be useful as the sign of presenting trend in wide economy with price pressure, India does not publish an official measure of core inflation. In graph 7, it shows that non-food manufacturing inflation has fallen to lower rates and have lower trends since 2011. Potential growth has slowed from around 8% prior to the global financial crisis to about 6% at the end of 2013. This implies that GDP at factor cost has been growing at about 1 to 2 percentage points below potential for the past 2 years. The rate of the non-food manufacturing component of the WPI and the rate of CPI inflation has decreased below the headline rate since 2012.
In India, both WPI, Wholesale Price Index, and CPI, Consumer Price Index, are used to measure inflation. The CPI calculates the difference in the price of commodities and services such as food, medical care, education, electronics, and anything that consumers buy for use. WPI calculates the goods or services sold by businesses to smaller businesses. IMF stated that policy measures to reduce inflation, improve fiscal position, and improve the ease of doing business helped reduce India's economic outlook. Since India has a lot of external factors, it is very important to take mixed measures to control inflation. There are 3 types of measures that the government can undertake to control inflation, and one of them is fiscal policy. This is the next step to control inflation in India so the economy can increase. Fiscal policy is when the government can cut spending and increase tax. This will significantly improve the government's budget situation and help to reduce demand in the economy. Since India has been experiencing high inflation and high growth, then reducing aggregate demand would be more acceptable, as reducing inflation would lead to more output and lower unemployment.
As stated in the content above, we can conclude that inflation is not good for an economy of country when it is too high, because the value of money will drop, as well as giving bad impact to the cost of living for society and economic growth. The excess demand and shortage of supply in India has caused the inflation to spike. However, low and stable inflation also help the economy to operate efficiently. In order to control inflation, India must use anti-inflationary policy perception. For example, in India there are a lot of food inflation occur due to increase in wholesale price index of necessary food item relative to the general index. So the demand for such necessities such as wheat and meat, their price should be controlled to avoid excess price markup. In my opinion, India have the ability to reduce their inflation if their government able to apply fiscal policy by increasing tax and reducing government expenditure, and also monetary policy led by the Reserve Bank of India to reduce the money demanded and purchasing activity. In order to solve the spike in inflation, India need to focus on their cause of problems such as pricing and wage policy and output production. Okay, last but not least, here we include all the reference of the information about our topic, and that's all from us. Thank you.